This is a video on how to improve your NBME scores to the 90% range and secure a high pass on step one. So at the start of our dedicated period, our school administered an exam called the Comprehensive Basic Sciences Exam, or CBSA, which is basically a 200 question practice exam for step one. So this was at the beginning of our dedicated period. Most students haven't studied at all. And if they did study, it was very little. So the exam scores were around 40 to 50% for most people. That was the average on that one. Some people that kept up with their Anki or were way above average intelligence were able to get in the 60s on the exam, which made them able to get a low pass if they took the real thing. And the way the score was broken down for us, it gave us our percent, and then it also gave us our percent chance of passing step if we took it next week. So people that got like around 60%, they would have like a 50 to like 70% chance of passing step one, which is okay, but that's not where you want to be. You don't want to risk a 30% chance of failing step one. That's still a pretty high chance of failing. And on this exam, I ended up getting an 80% overall, which made me one of the highest scorers in the class. And that translates to roughly a 99% chance of passing step one. And to keep in mind, this was the beginning of our dedicated. This was week one, and I already had a high pass on our first practice exam. By the end of my dedicated, I ended up scoring a 91% on the free 120, which is the most similar exam to step. I was already ready to take step by that point, but I but by the time I took the CBSA, but I wanted to keep improving my scores because I wanted to do as good as possible on the exam. And with this guide, we'll easily go from potentially barely passing NBMEs to getting 90s on all of your practice exams. And some of you might be asking, since step one is pass fail, why should it matter if I'm getting 60s on NBMEs or if I'm getting 90s on them, since both of them are passing grades? And to this, I say that while step one is not scored anymore, it's pass fail, scoring really high on this exam will set you up for success on clinical rotations and for step two, since so much of the basic science content carries over to that exam as well. And if you are getting low passes on NBMEs, there's another risk, and that risk is the chance of you failing. Because while getting like around a 60 gives you around a 70% chance of passing, there's still a 30% chance that you don't end up passing, and that'd be terrible. If you're planning on going into a competitive specialty, that will basically kill your chances of ever matching there. So it's best not to take the chance at all and just try to do your absolute best on this exam. Pretend like it's scored. That's how hard you want to study for it, and be able to maximize your rotation or your performance when you're rotating and later for when you're studying for step two. Now, what is it that you need to succeed in step one? I believe there are two important steps for being able to know the information well enough to get questions right on medical school exams, such as the CBSA or NBMEs or STEP or UWorld. First, you need to be able to learn that information, which is obvious for anyone listening to this. You wouldn't have got to medical school if you didn't know you have to learn information first before you can apply it. But then there's another second crucial step, which is being able to retain that information, which I believe is just as important. So, how would I advise doing that? For that, I think it depends on what stage of your medical education you are currently in. For example, if you're currently a first year medical student, my advice for retaining information for STEP would be different than for someone that has their exam approaching in a week, because you have to retain for like a much longer period of time, and there's like a lot more information you have to go through in your first year of medical school than what you need for STEP. So, as a first year student, I think the absolute highest yield thing that you can do for retention is to make sure you're using the OnKing Anki deck in every single class, and then keeping up with the Anki cards throughout the year. Like, keep them going, don't suspend them after a class is over. I know this can be super overwhelming, and this can be difficult to keep up with, but trust me when I say that your future self will thank you immensely for doing this and keeping up with it. To be completely honest with you, I even struggle to keep up with my Anki sometimes. And there were some classes where I just suspended like all my cards altogether because I couldn't bear to see that I had 1,600 like red cards on my review screen. when I opened Anki, and the red cards mean it was like learning stages. What I knew as a first year was that Anki was super important for retaining information, but no one ever told me how to properly use it. So I always had to build up of cards when I opened it every day. So my advice for Anki is this. First, you want to turn on FSRS, which basically customizes the algorithm to you. So if if Anki thinks you're about to like forget a card in 4 days and it'll show you the card again in 3 days, that's basically what FSRS does. There's a lot more like details to it. There's like 19 different parameters that FSRS uses, but you don't have to worry about that. Just turn it on in the settings and let it run. Set your desired retention. You can choose like any retention you want. The higher it is, the shorter the interval of the cards will be, so you'll see them again and again more likely or sooner. But if you lower your retention, you'll see the cards like more spaced out. For me personally, I set the retention to zero point 0.8. And my second tip is to unsuspend cards very selectively, i.e., don't unsuspend cards about all four classes of cardiac antiarrhythmic drugs all at once. Otherwise, you'll have hundreds of new cards, and you'll get overwhelmed and can't finish them. So my recommendation is if you're going through a class, your first priority should always be to do the review cards for that day, which is basically the green cards on Anki. Make sure it says 0 for the review cards. And then after that, after you've done all your review cards, then you can start on suspending new cards. If you unsuspend new cards while you still have a ton of review cards that you haven't done yet, you will quickly get overwhelmed and you won't be able to keep up with your Anki. It's better to keep up with like a small amount of cards than to add a bunch of new cards and only see them like once or twice because you have like way too many cards in your backlog. When you are unsuspending cards, be cautious not to unsuspend too many cards to the point where you no longer feel motivated to finish them. For example, if you had 4 lectures today for cardiology, it would be a good idea to suspend only the cards associated with the first lecture of that day. If you feel like suspending all 4 lectures, would lead to way too high of a card count and lead to you neglecting your Anki. You can always use the rest of the week or the weekend to catch up on cards that you haven't started doing yet. By the way, if you need more information than this on how Anki works and how to use it properly, I made a program that teaches you specifically how to use Anki and retain as much information as possible. You can find it under the top link of the description. When you're getting closer to dedicated, it's possible that you find that you still don't know a lot of the information from previous classes. Either you never learned it properly in the first place or if you forgot it. And this happens even if you've been consistent with Anki because no one is capable of remembering 100% of everything that they've learned. If you find that you've forgotten a lot of information, then it's important to remember that you won't be able to retain information if you've never even learned it in the first place. That's why I say that getting questions right is a two-step process. First, you have to learn the information, and then you have to be able to retain the information so that you can apply it. Anki should only ever be used for retention. If you don't know something, you should not be using Anki to try to learn it. Only use Anki after you feel like you've learned a subject well enough. If you have forgotten information, then the absolute best way to relearn something is through doing random UWorld or Amboss question blocks. Trust me, I know your scores are gonna suck if you try to learn information this way, or you're gonna have to bear through the 10% or 20% scores because UWorld and Amboss remain the absolute best ways to learn information. I know you're gonna miss a lot of questions because you've forgotten a lot of information, but be completely fine with getting like 30% on a random block. There's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean you're learning less than if you got 100% on it. What you should keep in mind though is that you should thoroughly review every explanation and make sure that you've like read every answer and made sure why it's wrong and why the correct answer is right. And as you're doing the blocks, make sure you're marking questions when you're guessing on them. And this is important for later. Once you finish a block, make sure you have this Anki add-on called Find Anki Cards from UWorld Test installed. And use this to take the questions you got wrong and also the questions you marked on UWorld and paste this into Anki to find those cards. I have the add-on linked in the description for you to start using it as soon as possible. What this add-on will allow you to do is to master topics that were difficult to you during UWorld. This will allow you to consistently refine your knowledge and eventually start doing as amazing as possible as soon as you start doing NBMEs. For content review, I recommend keeping it very light. I never did a comprehensive review of first aid or any other resource, and you don't need to either. What I recommend most for content review is Patoma chapters 1 through 3, and also do the Anki cards, keep up with those. And then also do Anki cards for a sketchy micro. For me personally, I didn't watch the sketchy micro videos. I didn't find them to be that helpful. I learned better from Anki than I did from sketchy micro. But I did still use the tag sketchy micro in Anki because I found that was the most organized way to like unsuspend like one bug one by one. And if you like doing sketchy, then use sketchy micro if you want. Watch the video and then do the Anki cards afterwards, as I've recommended earlier. But be sure you're not doing too many cards, not unsuspending too many cards in one day, otherwise you'll get overwhelmed. I recommend keeping the number of cards you unsuspend very low so that it does not become overwhelming for you. For me, what that meant was that I was only unsuspending 1 to 2 bugs every single day, and I would only watch one Patoma video every day and unsuspending the cards from there. I would try not to do more than that because I knew if I tried to do like all of Patoma chapters 1 through 3 in one day, then I would have like 1,000 new cards and I would get overwhelmed and not be able to finish it. So try to do at least one video a day, 1 to 2 bugs a day. And if you keep up with this strategy of doing like a small amount of U World every day, a small amount of Patoma every day, and a small amount of sketchy microcards every day, you will eventually start taking NBMEs and realizing you're getting 80s to 90s on the exams without even feeling like you've studied a crazy amount because you've only been doing like small amounts every single day and keeping consistent with it. Consistency is the key to doing well in medical school. If you want personal one on one tutoring or to join a group with similar minded medical students, I recommend clicking the top link in the description. Otherwise, I bid you farewell and I wish you the best of luck on your exams.